They trusted him with her life. They trusted him because he wasn't just a doctor. He was family. He was the husband's best friend, the man who stood next to him through school, jobs, birthdays, even the day he proposed. So when he said, "A C-section is the safest way," they didn't question it. When he walked her into the operating room, they believed she was in the safest hands possible. But after the twins were born, something began to take her life backwards. A smell, a pain, a fever, symptoms dismissed as normal C-section healing. But she knew something wasn't right. Her father knew too. And by the time another hospital scanned her abdomen, the truth was staring them in the face. A discovery so shocking that investigators would later ask a question no one ever imagined. Was this a mistake? Or something much darker? Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Rachel Elizabeth Donovan grew up in a modest brick home on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Her father, Richard Donovan, spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, a man who believed that anything worth doing was worth doing right the first time. He taught Rachel to change a tire before she turned 16, to balance a checkbook before she left for college, and to trust her instincts even when everyone around her said otherwise. Her mother, Catherine, was a second-grade teacher who filled their home with laughter and the smell of fresh bread on Sunday mornings. When Catherine was diagnosed with ovarian cancer during Rachel's freshman year of college, the family held on to hope until there was none left to hold. She passed away 3 weeks before Rachel's 20th birthday, leaving Richard as the only parent Rachel would ever have again. Richard poured everything into his daughter after that loss. He drove 4 hours each way to attend her college graduation. He helped her move into her first apartment. He was there when she called crying after her first heartbreak, and he was there when she called laughing to tell him she had met someone special. That someone was David Mitchell, a business major from Norfolk with an easy smile and a laugh that could fill a room. David and Rachel met during a charity event when she was a sophomore, and within 6 months, they were inseparable. He proposed 8 years later on a hiking trail in Shenandoah National Park, and Rachel said yes before he finished the question. Their wedding was small but perfect, held in the same church where her parents had married 3 decades earlier. For 7 years, Rachel and David built a life together. They bought a house in the suburbs. They adopted a rescue dog named Biscuit. They talked about children the way young couples do, with excitement and fear in equal measure. When Rachel finally became pregnant in early 2019, the news felt like a gift they had waited their whole lives to receive. The ultrasound revealed not 1 heartbeat, but 2. Twins. A boy and a girl. David wept in the examination room. Rachel laughed through her own tears. Richard, when he heard the news, sat down in his kitchen chair and thanked God out loud for the first time in years. None of them could have known that Rachel's joy had already been marked. None of them could have imagined that the man who would deliver those babies had spent 15 years waiting for exactly this moment. Now, before we continue this incredible story, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Trust me, you are going to want to see what happens next. Jonathan Andrew Mercer was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, the only child of a high school principal and a dental hygienist who divorced when he was 11 years old. His father moved to Florida and remarried within 2 years. His mother worked double shifts to keep them in their small apartment, which meant Jonathan spent most of his adolescence alone with his textbooks and his thoughts. He was brilliant in ways that made other children uncomfortable. He could solve calculus problems before his classmates understood fractions. He memorized entire chapters of biology textbooks for fun. But brilliance without social grace is a lonely thing, and Jonathan learned early that intelligence does not guarantee friendship. Everything changed when his mother remarried and moved them to a new school district the summer before 8th grade. On his first day at Westfield Middle School, a boy named David Mitchell sat down next to him in the cafeteria and asked if he wanted to trade his apple for a bag of chips. It was a small gesture, the kind most people would forget by the end of the day. Jonathan never forgot it. David was everything Jonathan was not. He was athletic where Jonathan was clumsy. He was charming where Jonathan was awkward. He moved through social situations with an ease that seemed almost supernatural to a boy who had spent his childhood on the margins. But David never treated Jonathan like a project or a charity case. He treated him like an equal, like a friend, like a brother. Their friendship survived high school, survived different colleges, survived the natural drift that pulls most childhood friendships apart. When David needed help passing organic chemistry, Jonathan tutored him for free. When Jonathan was mocked by teammates during a disastrous attempt at joining the basketball team, David was the one who confronted them in the locker room. They were the kind of friends who could go months without speaking and pick up exactly where they left off. David trusted Jonathan with his fears, his failures, his future. He invited him to family dinners. He asked his opinion on major life decisions. He called him brother and meant it. What David never understood, what he could not have understood, was that Jonathan had been carrying something far heavier than friendship for over a decade. Behind every smile, behind every supportive word, behind every toast at every celebration, Jonathan harbored a wound that had never healed. And wounds left untreated have a way of turning into something else entirely. The University of Virginia campus in autumn of 2004 was a postcard come to life. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, and students moved between classes with the easy confidence of people who believed the world was waiting for them. Jonathan was a sophomore that year, buried in pre-med coursework and spending most of his evenings alone in the science library. David was a junior finishing his business degree, already thinking about graduate school and the life he would build after graduation. They lived in different dormitories but met for dinner at least twice a week, a ritual that had survived since their freshman year. It was during one of those dinners, in the crowded chaos of the main dining hall, that Jonathan first noticed her. She was sitting 3 tables away with a group of friends, laughing at something someone had said. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a blue sweater that matched her eyes. Jonathan stopped eating. He stopped breathing. He stared at her for so long that David noticed and turned to see what had captured his attention. Her name was Rachel Donovan. She was a sophomore studying communications, and according to the friend of a friend David consulted, she was smart, kind, and very much single. What began as attraction quickly became something else entirely. Jonathan found himself rearranging his schedule to maximize the chances of seeing her. He discovered that she studied at the main library on Monday and Wednesday evenings, so he abandoned his usual spot in the science building and relocated. He learned that she bought coffee every Tuesday morning at a small shop near the communications building, so he started arriving at 8:15, ordering a drink he did not want, and sitting where he could watch the door. He memorized the route she walked between her dormitory and her afternoon classes. He knew which bench she preferred when the weather was warm enough to sit outside. None of this felt strange to him. In his mind, he was simply a man who had found the woman he was meant to be with. He was gathering information the way any reasonable person would before making an important decision. He told himself that once they actually spoke, once she had a chance to see who he really was, everything would fall into place. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon in late October, he approached her. His hands were sweating. His voice cracked when he introduced himself. She smiled politely, the way you smile at a stranger asking for directions, and they talked for 12 minutes. Jonathan counted every one of them. She asked about his major, and he told her about medical school. She mentioned she was from Richmond, and he pretended he had family there. When her friends called her over, she said it was nice meeting him and walked away without looking back. Jonathan stood frozen in place for nearly a full minute after she left, replaying every word, every gesture, every micro-expression he thought he had detected. In his version of the conversation, she had been interested. She had laughed at his comment about organic chemistry. She had touched her hair twice, which he had read somewhere was a sign of attraction. He spent the next 2 weeks imagining their first date, their first kiss, their future together. He had already decided that she was his. What he did not realize, what he could not have known, was that Rachel had already noticed someone else. and that someone was his best friend. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you have made it this far, type, "I am still here," so I can see who is on this journey with me. 3 weeks after Jonathan's awkward introduction, David Mitchell met Rachel Donovan at a Halloween party hosted by a mutual friend in an off-campus apartment. The place was packed with students in costumes, the music was too loud, and the punch was stronger than anyone admitted. David came dressed as a cowboy. Rachel wore a flapper dress from the 1920s. They found themselves standing next to each other near the makeshift bar, both reaching for the same bottle of soda at the same time. David apologized. Rachel laughed. And just like that, a conversation began that would last until 3 in the morning. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about losing her mother, and he listened without trying to fix her pain. He told her about his dream of starting his own company someday, and she asked questions that showed she was actually interested. By the time the party wound down, David had asked for her number, and Rachel had given it without a moment of hesitation. They went on their first date the following Friday, a dinner at a small Italian restaurant where the portions were enormous, and the candles flickered on checkered tablecloths. Jonathan was at that party. He had positioned himself near the kitchen, nursing a drink he barely touched, waiting for the right moment to approach Rachel again. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had planned to reference their previous conversation, to build on the connection he believed they had established. But before he could make his move, he saw David walk up to her. He watched them reach for the same bottle. He watched her laugh at something David said. He watched their bodies turn toward each other, the unmistakable geometry of mutual attraction. For the next 4 hours, Jonathan remained at that party. He could not bring himself to leave. He stood in corners, sat on couches, pretended to be interested in conversations he could not hear over the roaring in his ears. Every few minutes, his eyes would find them again, still talking, still laughing, still leaning closer. When they finally exchanged phones to enter their numbers, Jonathan felt something inside him collapse. He left the party without saying goodbye to anyone and walked back to his dormitory in the cold October air. He did not sleep that night. Jonathan learned about Rachel and David officially 2 days later. David called him, excited and nervous, describing the girl he had met at the party. When David mentioned her name, Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. He asked if David was sure they were talking about the same Rachel, the communications major from Richmond. David confirmed it, oblivious to the meaning behind the question. Jonathan congratulated him. He said he was happy for them. He asked David to keep him updated and ended the call as quickly as he could. That night, Jonathan did not sleep. He lay in his narrow dormitory bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his 12-minute conversation with Rachel. He had seen her first. He had talked to her first. And now David, who had never even noticed her before that party, had simply walked in and taken what should have been his. Jonathan made a decision that night, one that would shape the next 15 years of his life. He chose silence. He smiled when David brought Rachel to dinner. He nodded when they held hands. He performed the role of supportive best friend so convincingly that neither of them ever suspected the truth. 4 years passed. David and Rachel graduated. They found jobs in their respective fields. They moved into an apartment together in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and began building the life they had talked about during late-night conversations in college. Jonathan, meanwhile, threw himself into medical school with a focus that bordered on obsession. He graduated near the top of his class. He was accepted into a competitive obstetrics and gynecology residency program. He told everyone that medicine was his passion, that delivering babies was his calling. What he never told anyone was that medicine was also his escape, a place where his mind could not wander to thoughts of Rachel. In the spring of 2012, David called Jonathan with news that had been years in the making. He was going to propose. He had bought a ring, planned a trip to Shenandoah National Park, and rehearsed his speech so many times he could recite it backward. He asked Jonathan to help him plan the moment, and Jonathan agreed without missing a beat. He offered suggestions for the timing, the location, the perfect words. He helped his best friend prepare to marry the woman Jonathan still thought about every single day. Rachel said yes. Of course she did. David called Jonathan that same night, practically shouting with joy, and Jonathan said all the right things. He said he was thrilled. He said they deserved each other. He said he could not wait to celebrate with them. 2 months later, at an engagement party held in a rented ballroom, Jonathan gave a toast that brought tears to Rachel's eyes. He spoke about friendship, about loyalty, about the rare gift of finding someone who makes you better. The guests applauded. Rachel hugged him. David called him the best friend a man could ask for. That night, alone in his apartment, Jonathan opened a journal he had kept since college and wrote a single entry that investigators would later recover as evidence. The words were simple and chilling. She made her choice. But choices have consequences. Life has a way of settling debts. He closed the journal and placed it back on his shelf. And then he waited. If you are finding value in this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you care about. Stories like this one remind us to protect the people we love. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in May of 2012 at a historic church in Richmond where generations of Rachel's family had celebrated their most sacred moments. The weather was perfect. The flowers were white roses and baby's breath. The guest list included 142 people who had gathered to witness 2 lives becoming one. Jonathan Mercer stood at the altar in a tailored gray suit, positioned exactly where David had asked him to be, directly to the right of the groom. He watched Rachel walk down the aisle on her father's arm, and he felt something inside him crack. She wore a dress that caught the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. She was smiling at David, only at David, with a look of pure and absolute love. Jonathan performed his duties flawlessly. He handed David the ring at the exact right moment. He kept the groom calm during the nervous minutes before the ceremony. He posed for photographs with a smile that revealed nothing of what he was feeling. At the reception, he danced with bridesmaids and laughed at the speeches and raised his glass when the best man offered a toast. No one noticed anything unusual. No one suspected that the man standing closest to the groom was quietly unraveling. Later that evening, when most guests had either left or were too drunk to notice, Jonathan slipped outside to the parking lot and sat alone in his car for nearly an hour. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply sat there in the darkness, thinking about everything he had lost without ever having it. The next morning, he sent a text message to a former college roommate, someone who had known about his feelings for Rachel years earlier. The message was brief, but revealing. Hardest day of my life. But I smiled through it. His roommate responded with sympathy and an offer to talk, but Jonathan never followed up. He returned to his residency program that Monday with a new determination. He would become the best doctor in his field. He would build a career that commanded respect. And he would wait for the day when life would finally settle the score. What Jonathan did not understand, what perhaps he could never understand, was that wounds left untreated do not disappear with time. They fester beneath the surface, growing darker and more dangerous with every passing year. And 15 years is a very long time to let something fester. Jonathan Mercer completed his residency in obstetrics and gynecology in 2015 and was immediately recruited by one of the most prestigious hospitals in Virginia. His supervisors described him as meticulous, disciplined, and exceptionally talented. His colleagues admired his ability to remain calm under pressure. His patients trusted him with the most vulnerable moments of their lives, the delivery of their children into the world. Within 3 years, he had built a reputation that extended well beyond the hospital walls. Other physicians referred their most complicated cases to him. Medical students competed for the chance to observe his surgeries. He was invited to speak at conferences and published research papers that earned recognition from national obstetric associations. Jonathan embraced his success with what appeared to be humble gratitude. He thanked his mentors publicly. He praised his surgical teams. He never took credit alone and always deflected attention to the collaborative nature of medicine. But those who worked closest to him noticed something else beneath the professional exterior. He was exacting to the point of coldness. He demanded perfection from his staff and showed little patience for errors. He maintained few personal relationships and rarely attended social gatherings. One nurse who worked with him for several years later described him as someone who kept the world at arm's length. He was brilliant and he knew it, she said. But there was something behind his eyes that never quite warmed up. Medicine gave Jonathan something he had lacked his entire life. It gave him control. In the operating room, he was not the awkward boy who lost the girl to his more charming friend. He was the expert whose hands decided outcomes. Every successful delivery reinforced his sense of power. Every grateful family confirmed his value. For years, that was enough to keep the bitterness at bay. He threw himself into his work with a focus that left little room for the jealousy that had once consumed him. He even managed to maintain his friendship with David, attending occasional dinners and holiday gatherings where he played the role of devoted family friend. But in early 2019, everything changed. Rachel Donovan Mitchell became pregnant. And her husband, trusting as always, wanted his best friend to deliver their children. Thank you so much for your incredible support. This channel grows because of viewers like you who show up and engage with these stories. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider joining our YouTube membership for exclusive perks, premium content, and early access to upcoming documentaries. Your membership helps us keep bringing you the stories that matter. The years between the wedding and the pregnancy unfolded, with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. David and Rachel moved twice, first to a larger apartment, and then to a 4-bedroom house in a suburb north of Richmond. David climbed the corporate ladder at a financial consulting firm, eventually becoming a senior vice president with a corner office and a salary that exceeded anything his younger self had imagined. Rachel transitioned from marketing to freelance consulting, which allowed her to work from home and build a schedule around the family she hoped to have. They adopted Biscuit, a 3-year-old golden retriever mix with one floppy ear and an inexhaustible supply of energy. They hosted dinner parties. They took vacations to beach towns and mountain cabins. They were, by every visible measure, living the American dream. Jonathan remained on the periphery of their world, present, but never central. He attended Thanksgiving dinners when his schedule allowed, always bringing an expensive bottle of wine and a carefully chosen hostess gift. He sent flowers on Rachel's birthday every year, signed simply, "From Jonathan," professional enough to avoid suspicion but personal enough to remind her he existed. He called David every few months to catch up, conversations that covered work and sports, and the safe topics that longtime friends default to when deeper connection has faded. To anyone observing from the outside, he was the model of a devoted friend, consistent and reliable and entirely appropriate. But there were moments, small and private, that revealed what Jonathan was really feeling. At David and Rachel's 5th anniversary party, he watched them dance together in their backyard, Rachel's head resting on David's shoulder, and he excused himself to the bathroom where he gripped the sink until his knuckles turned white. During a Christmas gathering in 2016, David pulled him aside to share the news that he and Rachel were trying to have a baby. Jonathan smiled and offered congratulations, and later that night he sat in his car outside their house for 20 minutes before driving home. When Rachel suffered a miscarriage in 2017, David called Jonathan for support, and Jonathan listened to his best friend cry, while something dark and shameful flickered in his chest. He hated himself for feeling it, but he felt it nonetheless. Jonathan tried to date during those years. He went through the motions, creating profiles on apps and accepting setups from well-meaning colleagues. He took women to nice restaurants and asked appropriate questions and performed the rituals of modern courtship. But nothing ever progressed beyond a few dates. The women he met were attractive and intelligent and entirely wrong. They laughed at different things than Rachel laughed at. They moved through the world in ways that felt foreign to him. He told himself he was simply selective, that he had high standards, that the right person had not come along yet. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. He was still waiting for Rachel. He had been waiting for 15 years. Rachel tolerated his presence more than she enjoyed it. Something about Jonathan had always made her slightly uneasy, though she could never articulate exactly what. He was unfailingly polite, consistently thoughtful, and entirely appropriate in every interaction. Yet there was a quality to his attention that felt too focused, a precision to his kindness that seemed rehearsed rather than genuine. She mentioned this to David once, early in their marriage, and he laughed it off. "That is just Jonathan," he said. "He has always been a little awkward. He does not mean anything by it." David's certainty quieted Rachel's concerns, but it did not erase them. She simply learned to manage her discomfort, to smile through holiday gatherings and change the subject when David suggested inviting Jonathan to dinner. Meanwhile, Jonathan watched from a distance as the life he believed should have been his continued to flourish. He saw the house, the dog, the promotions, the happiness. He saw a woman who had chosen someone else building a future that excluded him entirely. And with every passing year, the weight of what he had lost pressed harder against something dark inside him. He was waiting, though he could not have said exactly what he was waiting for. And then, in February of 2019, he received a phone call that made everything clear. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of February 2019. Jonathan was between appointments, reviewing patient charts in his office, when his personal cell phone buzzed with David's name on the screen. They had not spoken in nearly 2 months, and Jonathan assumed the call was about scheduling a dinner or perhaps coordinating plans for an upcoming birthday. He answered with his usual measured warmth, the voice he had perfected over 2 decades of performing friendship. David could barely contain himself. His words tumbled out in an excited rush, the kind of breathless delivery that accompanies news too big to hold inside. Rachel was pregnant. After 3 years of trying, after countless disappointments and one heartbreaking miscarriage, she was finally carrying a child. But that was not all. The ultrasound had revealed 2 heartbeats. They were having twins, a boy and a girl, due in mid-June. David was crying by the time he finished the sentence, tears of joy that came through clearly even over the phone. Jonathan said all the right things. He congratulated David with enthusiasm. He asked about Rachel's health and the status of the pregnancy. He expressed the appropriate level of surprise and delight. And then David asked the question that Jonathan had been waiting 15 years to hear. He wanted Jonathan to be their doctor. It made perfect sense from David's perspective. His best friend was one of the top obstetricians in the state. Rachel would receive the best possible care from someone who genuinely cared about their family. There was no reason to trust a stranger when they had Jonathan. He asked the question as though the answer were already settled, as though he were simply confirming a formality. Jonathan paused for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to seem thoughtful, but not so long as to raise concerns. He said he would be honored. He said nothing would make him happier than helping bring their children into the world. He said they were family, and family takes care of each other. When the call ended, Jonathan sat alone in his office for a long time. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. But something had shifted behind his eyes, a calculation clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. After 15 years of watching from the sidelines, life had finally presented him with an opportunity, and he had no intention of letting it pass. Rachel arrived for her first prenatal appointment on a gray morning in early March 2019. The hospital where Jonathan practiced was a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings, all polished floors and muted colors, and the constant hum of efficiency. David had taken the morning off work to accompany her, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back as they navigated the hallways toward the obstetrics wing. Rachel was nervous in the way all first-time mothers are nervous, a mixture of excitement and fear that settled somewhere between her chest and her stomach. But there was something else too, a discomfort she could not name, a reluctance she had not shared with her husband. Jonathan greeted them in the examination room with a warmth that seemed entirely genuine. He shook David's hand firmly and embraced Rachel in a brief, appropriate hug. He asked about their drive, about David's work, about the renovations they had mentioned during their last dinner together months ago. He was charming in a way Rachel had rarely seen from him, more relaxed than she remembered, more present. She found herself wondering if she had misjudged him all these years. The examination proceeded without incident. Jonathan reviewed her medical history with meticulous attention, asking about her family's health background, any previous pregnancies, medications she was taking. He discussed the unique considerations of twin pregnancies, explaining the increased monitoring, the dietary recommendations, the warning signs to watch for. He answered every question with patience and expertise. He addressed his comments to both of them equally, never focusing too intently on either one. When David's phone buzzed with an urgent work call, he excused himself apologetically. "I will just be a minute," he said, stepping into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, and Rachel found herself alone with Jonathan for the first time in years. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. His posture shifted, his voice dropped slightly. The professional distance that had characterized the examination seemed to evaporate. He looked at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, as though he was seeing something no one else could see. "You look exactly the same as you did in college," he said, "like no time has passed at all." Rachel laughed politely, the way you laugh when you do not know how else to respond. She said something about pregnancy hormones and changed the subject, asking a question about prenatal vitamins that she already knew the answer to. Jonathan answered professionally, but his eyes remained fixed on hers for a moment too long. When David returned, apologizing for the interruption, the atmosphere shifted back to normal so quickly that Rachel wondered if she had imagined the entire thing. On the drive home, David asked how she was feeling about everything. Rachel considered telling him about the moment with Jonathan, about the comment and the look and the strange electricity in the room. But what would she say exactly? "He complimented me? He looked at me?" It sounded paranoid even in her own head. She was pregnant and hormonal, and probably overreacting. She told David she felt great about the appointment, that Jonathan clearly knew what he was doing, that they were in good hands. But that night, lying in bed beside her sleeping husband, Rachel replayed the moment over and over. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself Jonathan was simply being kind. But somewhere deep in her instincts, in the place where mothers-to-be learn to trust what they cannot explain, a warning had been sounded. The weeks between that first appointment and Rachel's due date passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. David painted the nursery a soft shade of yellow, chosen because it would work for both a boy and a girl. Rachel's father drove up from Richmond 3 times to help assemble cribs and dressers, and the complicated contraption that would eventually become a double stroller. Friends threw a baby shower that filled their living room with gifts and laughter, and enough tiny clothing to outfit a small army. Rachel felt her body changing in ways both miraculous and uncomfortable. She documented everything in a journal she planned to give the twins someday, entries filled with hope and wonder, and the occasional moment of fear. Jonathan remained a constant presence throughout those months. He adjusted his schedule to accommodate Rachel's appointments. He called between visits to check on her symptoms and answer questions. He texted David with articles about twin pregnancies and recommended reading for expectant fathers. David was deeply grateful. He told Rachel repeatedly how lucky they were to have someone like Jonathan in their corner, a world-class physician who cared about them personally. Rachel nodded and agreed, but the unease that had started during that first appointment never fully disappeared. It lived in the background of her days, a low-frequency hum she could not quite tune out. She mentioned her discomfort to her father during one of his visits, choosing her words carefully so as not to seem irrational. "I do not know what it is," she said. "He has not done anything wrong, but something about him feels off." Richard listened with the attentiveness of a man who had spent his life trusting his own instincts. He asked questions. He observed Jonathan during Rachel's next appointment, which he insisted on attending. Afterward, he pulled Rachel aside. He told her that if she was uncomfortable, she should find another doctor. He did not care about David's feelings or the friendship. He cared about her. Rachel considered it seriously for nearly a week. She researched other obstetricians. She drafted a conversation she might have with David. But in the end, she could not bring herself to do it. She did not want to hurt her husband. She did not want to damage a friendship that meant so much to him. And so she stayed silent, convincing herself that everything would be fine. The recommendation came during a routine appointment in late April 2019, when Rachel was 32 weeks pregnant and her body had begun to feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her ankles were swollen. Her back ached constantly. She had not slept through the night in weeks. Jonathan performed the examination with his usual precision, measuring her abdomen, listening to both heartbeats, reviewing the latest ultrasound images. When he finished, he sat down across from Rachel and David with a legal pad covered in notes. His tone was measured and professional as he explained his concerns. Twin pregnancies carried inherent risks, he said, particularly regarding delivery. The babies were positioned in a way that made vaginal birth complicated. There was a possibility of cord complications if the first twin delivered successfully, but the second did not follow quickly. He cited statistics about emergency C-sections performed after failed vaginal attempts, about the stress such situations placed on both mother and babies. He recommended scheduling a cesarean section for mid-June, a controlled environment where he could manage every variable. Rachel had hoped for a natural birth. She had read books about it, watched videos, imagined the moment when she would feel her children enter the world through her own strength. The idea of surgery made her stomach clench. She asked if it was truly necessary, if there was any possibility of delivering naturally under close supervision. Jonathan listened to her concerns with patience. He acknowledged her preferences and said he understood her hesitation. But then he leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that felt almost physical. "I would never recommend anything that would put you at risk," he said. "Your safety and the safety of your children are my only priorities." David, who had been silent through most of the conversation, reached over and took Rachel's hand. He trusted Jonathan completely. He had trusted him for 20 years. If Jonathan said a C-section was the safest option, then a C-section was what they would do. Rachel looked at her husband, then at Jonathan, then down at her swollen belly where 2 lives depended on her decisions. She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand a second opinion. But the words would not come. She agreed to the surgery, and Jonathan scheduled it for June 14, 2019. Rachel could not sleep the night before her surgery. She lay in bed watching the digital clock on her nightstand flip through the hours, each minute bringing her closer to a moment she could not quite imagine. The red numbers glowed in the darkness. 1:47, 2:23, 3:15. Her mind cycled through every possible scenario, every complication she had read about, every statistic Jonathan had cited during their appointments. At 4:30 in the morning, she finally gave up on rest and went downstairs to sit with Biscuit, who had always seemed to sense when she needed comfort. The dog rested his head on her swollen belly, and Rachel stroked his ears while the sky outside slowly lightened from black to gray. She thought about her mother in those quiet hours. Catherine had been dead for 12 years now, but Rachel had never stopped missing her. She wondered what advice her mother would have given about the surgery, about Jonathan, about the strange feeling that had been following her through this pregnancy. Catherine had always trusted her instincts. She had taught Rachel to do the same. But Rachel had spent months ignoring what her instincts were telling her, and now it was too late to change course. She whispered a prayer into the silence of the kitchen, asking her mother to watch over her, to guide the surgeon's hands, to keep her babies safe. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. David found her there an hour later, already showered and dressed and vibrating with nervous energy. He made her a small breakfast she could barely eat, then double-checked the hospital bag they had packed weeks earlier. By 5:15 they were in the car, pulling out of their driveway for a trip that would take 20 minutes, but felt like it lasted hours. Rachel watched the familiar streets pass by in the early morning darkness, neighborhoods she had seen 1,000 times that now seemed strange and unfamiliar. She thought about the twins growing inside her, about the lives they would lead and the people they would become. She placed her hands on her belly and felt them move, a reassurance that made her eyes fill with tears. Richard was already waiting in the hospital lobby when they arrived at 5:45. He had driven up from Richmond the night before and stayed at a hotel nearby, unwilling to miss a single moment of his grandchildren's arrival. He embraced Rachel carefully, mindful of her condition, and shook David's hand with the firm grip of a man who trusted his son-in-law despite his reservations. His eyes searched Rachel's face, looking for signs of the anxiety he knew she was feeling. "You are going to do great, sweetheart," he said. "Your mother would be so proud." Rachel nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Together, the three of them made their way to the maternity ward, where nurses in cheerful scrubs guided Rachel through the preoperative preparations. Blood pressure checks, IV insertion, forms to sign and questions to answer. The hospital was waking up around them, the halls filling with the sounds and movements of a new day. David held her hand through all of it, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a gesture of comfort he had developed years ago. Richard sat in a chair by the window, watching his daughter with the fierce protectiveness that had defined his entire relationship with her. At 6:45, Jonathan arrived. He wore surgical scrubs and a confident smile, every inch the competent physician his reputation suggested. He reviewed the procedure with Rachel and David one final time, answered their last-minute questions, and assured them that everything was going to be fine. "In less than an hour," he said, "you will be holding your babies." The words should have been comforting. They should have eased the tension that had been building in Rachel's chest all morning. But as Jonathan spoke, as his eyes met hers with that familiar intensity, Rachel felt the warning pulse again. She pushed it down, buried it beneath the excitement and the fear and the overwhelming reality of what was about to happen. In less than an hour, she would be a mother. Nothing else mattered. The operating room was cold in the way all operating rooms are cold, a clinical chill designed to prevent bacterial growth and keep surgical teams alert. Rachel lay on the table beneath a thin sheet, her lower body numb from the epidural, her arms extended on padded supports, her eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles she would remember for years to come. The lights above her were impossibly bright, circular halos that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the machines surrounding her. She could hear the steady beep of the heart monitor, the soft whoosh of the ventilation system, the muffled voices of the surgical team preparing for the procedure. David sat beside her head in a chair the nurses had positioned specifically for anxious fathers. He held her hand and whispered reassurances, and tried not to look at the blue surgical drape that separated them from the procedure happening below. His face was pale beneath the surgical cap they had given him, but his grip on Rachel's hand was steady. "We are going to meet our babies," he said. "Can you believe it?" Rachel smiled at him, drawing strength from his excitement, from the love she saw in his eyes. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Jonathan worked with the precision that had defined his career. His movements were economical and exact, each action flowing into the next with practiced efficiency. The assisting nurses moved around him like dancers following a choreography they had performed countless times. The anesthesiologist monitored Rachel's vitals and made small adjustments that kept her comfortable and stable. To anyone watching, it was a routine surgery performed by a skilled physician. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to occur. At 7:34 a.m., Jonathan made the announcement they had all been waiting for. "It is a boy," he said. And seconds later, a cry filled the room, sharp and indignant and impossibly beautiful. Rachel wept. David wept. The nurses smiled at each other with the satisfaction of people who witness miracles as part of their daily routine. 2 minutes later, the girl arrived. She was smaller than her brother, but equally vocal, her lungs filling the operating room with sound that seemed far too large for her tiny body. Both babies were whisked to warming stations where pediatric nurses assessed their health and wrapped them in blankets. David was allowed to cut the cords, a moment he would describe later as the most profound experience of his life. Through it all, Jonathan continued working. He delivered the placentas. He checked for complications. And then something happened that only one person in the room would later remember as significant. Jonathan paused. His hands, which had been moving with such fluid precision, went still. He stood there, staring into Rachel's open abdomen, motionless. The moment lasted nearly 30 seconds, though it would feel much longer to Sandra Wellington, the veteran surgical nurse who was assisting. She glanced at Jonathan's face and saw something she could not identify, an expression that did not belong in an operating room. Then, just as suddenly as he had stopped, Jonathan resumed working. He began the process of closing the incision with the same methodical care he had brought to every other step. Rachel floated in a haze of exhaustion and joy and medication-induced numbness. She could hear her babies crying. She could see David's tear-streaked face smiling down at her. She could feel the tugging sensation of sutures being placed, distant and disconnected from her conscious mind. When Jonathan finally stepped back and announced that the surgery was complete, the room exhaled collectively. "Congratulations," he said, his voice carrying warmth that sounded entirely genuine. "You have two beautiful, healthy babies." No one noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he removed his gloves. No one noticed the sheen of sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Standard protocol in any surgical environment requires a meticulous count of every instrument used during a procedure. Before the first incision and after the final suture, surgical teams verify that every scalpel, every clamp, every sponge has been accounted for. The purpose is simple but critical. Tools left inside patients can cause catastrophic damage, from infection to organ perforation to death. The protocol exists to prevent tragedies that are entirely avoidable. Every nurse learns this in their first semester of training. Every surgeon knows the consequences of ignoring it. During Rachel's C-section, the circulating nurse was a 26-year-old named Patricia Holloway. She had graduated from nursing school 2 years earlier and had been working in the obstetrics department for 14 months. She was competent and careful, the kind of nurse who took her responsibilities seriously and followed protocols exactly as she had been trained. Her instructors had emphasized the instrument count above almost everything else. Count before, count after. If the numbers do not match, you do not close. It was that simple. Midway through the closing process, Patricia completed her post-operative instrument count. She stood at the surgical tray with her clipboard, checking each item against the preoperative list, placing a mark beside every tool that had been returned to its proper tray. Scalpel, check. Hemostats, check. Retractors, check. Forceps, check. She moved through the list methodically, her pen making small check marks in the margin. When she reached the end, she tallied the numbers. The pre-operative count listed 12 instruments. The post-operative count showed 11. Patricia felt her stomach drop. She counted again, more slowly this time, touching each instrument as she verified its presence. The numbers remained the same. One pair of surgical scissors, 7 inches long with curved blades, was not on the tray. It was not on the Mayo stand. It was not on the floor. It was nowhere in the operating room that she could see. Protocol was clear about what to do next. She was supposed to alert the surgeon immediately. She was supposed to insist on an X-ray before the patient was closed. She was supposed to escalate to the nursing supervisor if her concerns were dismissed. These were not suggestions. They were requirements. Patricia approached Jonathan quietly, mindful of the ongoing procedure and the family waiting to celebrate just beyond the surgical drape. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her voice professional and low. "Dr. Mercer," she said, "we have a discrepancy in the instrument count. One item appears to be missing. The scissors with the curved blade are not accounted for." Jonathan did not look up from his work. His hands continued their steady rhythm of suturing. "I have already verified everything," he said. "The count is correct. There is nothing missing." Patricia hesitated. She knew what she was supposed to do. She had been trained for exactly this moment. But Jonathan was a senior physician with 15 years of impeccable reputation. He had performed hundreds of surgeries without incident. She was a junior nurse who had never directly challenged a doctor's authority. She tried one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Mercer, I am certain there is a discrepancy. Protocol requires that we verify before closing. Should I call for an X-ray?" Jonathan finally looked up from his work. His eyes met hers, and Patricia felt something cold pass through her. It was not anger exactly, though there was that too. It was something emptier, something that made her take an involuntary step backward. "I said the count is correct," he said, his voice flat and final. "Do not hold up this room for a clerical error. Finish your paperwork." The other nurses in the room were watching now, their eyes moving between Patricia and Jonathan. No one spoke. The silence stretched for several seconds, broken only by the beeping of the monitors. Patricia backed away. She returned to her station and completed her documentation with hands that trembled slightly. In the notes section she wrote, "Post-op count showed discrepancy of one item. Attending physician verified count is correct. Closing proceeded per surgeon direction. She signed her name and dated the form. She told herself that if Dr. Mercer said everything was accounted for, then everything was accounted for. He was the expert. He was the one with the medical degree and the sterling reputation. She was just a nurse, following orders. Years later, she would testify about this moment in a courtroom. She would describe the look in Jonathan's eyes. She would explain why she had not pushed harder, why she had not insisted on the X-ray that would have revealed everything. I was scared of him, she would say. I did not understand why at the time, but I was scared. Rachel spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from the surgery before doctors cleared her to go home. The twins, whom they named Ethan and Emma, were healthy and thriving, their tiny bodies adapting to life outside the womb with the resilience that defines newborns. David barely left Rachel's side during those first 72 hours. He learned to change diapers. He mastered the art of swaddling. He fed the babies with bottles of pumped breast milk when Rachel needed rest. Richard visited every day, holding his grandchildren with a tenderness that made Rachel cry every time she witnessed it. The house felt different when they finally brought the twins home. It was louder, fuller, alive in a way it had never been before. Rachel's sister had flown in from California to help with the transition, and her presence filled the spaces that might otherwise have felt overwhelming. There were late-night feedings and early morning diaper changes. There were moments of exhaustion so profound that Rachel forgot her own name. But there were also moments of joy so pure they seemed to stop time itself. Ethan sleeping on David's chest. Emma gripping Rachel's finger with surprising strength. The four of them together in the nursery at sunrise, a family complete. Rachel's body was healing, or so she believed. The incision site was sore, but not unbearably so. She took the pain medication Jonathan had prescribed and followed the post-operative instructions she had been given. Jonathan called on the second day home to check on her progress. He asked about her pain levels, her appetite, her energy. He told her she was doing wonderfully and that everything sounded exactly as it should. He reminded her to call if anything felt unusual and said he would see her for a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. David thanked him profusely. He told Jonathan that they could never repay him for what he had done, for the care he had provided, for the healthy babies sleeping in the next room. Jonathan accepted the gratitude with characteristic humility. He said he was just doing his job. He said they were family. And when the call ended, Rachel felt a flicker of relief that surprised her. Maybe she had been wrong about him. Maybe the discomfort she had felt was nothing more than pregnancy hormones and pre-surgical anxiety. Maybe everything really was going to be fine. The fever started on a Monday. Rachel woke from a brief nap, feeling unusually warm, her forehead damp with sweat despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. She attributed it to hormones at first, to the dramatic shifts her body was experiencing as it tried to recover from pregnancy and surgery simultaneously. By that evening, when David took her temperature with the digital thermometer they had bought for the babies, the reading showed 99.8 degrees. Rachel called Jonathan's office the following morning. The nurse who answered took down her symptoms and promised to relay the message. Jonathan called back within the hour. He listened to her description of the fever, the mild soreness around the incision site, the general fatigue that seemed heavier than it should be. His voice was calm and reassuring as he explained that post-surgical infections were not uncommon. The body was fighting off bacteria introduced during the procedure, and sometimes that fight took longer than expected. He prescribed a stronger antibiotic and told her to call back in 3 days if she did not improve. Rachel filled the prescription that afternoon and began taking the medication as directed. She wanted to believe Jonathan's explanation. She needed to believe it. The twins required constant attention, and she did not have the energy to worry about her own health on top of everything else. But by day 12, the fever had climbed to 100.4. The soreness around her incision had intensified into a persistent ache that made it difficult to lift her babies without wincing. She called Jonathan again. This time, he came to the house personally. He examined the incision site and pronounced it clean. He pressed gently on her abdomen and noted some tenderness, but nothing alarming. He adjusted her antibiotic dosage, and added a second medication to address inflammation. He told David to make sure Rachel rested and stayed hydrated. He said the infection was stubborn but not unusual, and that her body simply needed more time to heal. Rachel watched him leave from her bedroom window, his car disappearing down the street that had become her entire world. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that a man who had been her husband's best friend for 20 years would never lead her wrong. But the pain in her body was telling a different story, and she was running out of reasons to ignore it. By the third week after surgery, Rachel had stopped pretending everything was fine. The pain had localized to a specific point in her lower abdomen, a spot she could have drawn on a map with surgical precision. It throbbed constantly, a deep pulse that seemed synchronized with her heartbeat. The fever came and went unpredictably, spiking in the afternoons and dropping at night, only to return again the following day. She had lost 8 pounds despite eating regularly. Her face had taken on a grayish pallor that made her sister gasp when she arrived one morning. Simple tasks had become impossible. Rachel could no longer lift Ethan without feeling a sharp, stabbing pain that made her vision blur. She could not bend over Emma's crib to check on her without bracing herself against the railing. Walking from the bedroom to the bathroom left her winded and dizzy. She began to fear that she was failing her children, that she was supposed to be caring for them, and instead she could barely care for herself. She cried in the shower where no one could hear her. She smiled through feedings when all she wanted to do was scream. The worst part was something Rachel could barely bring herself to acknowledge, even to herself. There was a smell. It had started faintly, a slight sourness she noticed during her first shower at home. She had attributed it to the surgical site healing, to the combination of medication and bandages and her body's natural processes, but the smell had grown stronger. It clung to her clothing. It permeated the bathroom after she used it. It was unlike anything she had experienced before, a scent that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere unreachable. Rachel spent hours in the bathroom with the door locked, examining herself in the mirror, trying to identify the source of her body's betrayal. She cried silently so David would not hear, so her sister would not worry, so the babies would not absorb her fear through whatever mysterious connection mothers share with their children. She felt ashamed in a way she could not articulate, as though her body was failing some fundamental test of womanhood. She had brought 2 lives into the world, and now something inside her was rotting. She could smell it, she could feel it, and no one seemed to understand how serious it was. The internet became her enemy during those late-night hours when she could not sleep. She searched her symptoms obsessively, reading medical websites and message boards, terrifying herself with possibilities she could not verify. Infection, necrosis, sepsis. The words blurred together in her exhausted mind. She knew she should stop reading, should trust her doctor, should believe that Jonathan would never let her suffer if there was something truly wrong. But her body knew what her mind refused to accept. Something was very, very wrong. She finally told David on a Thursday night after the twins were asleep and her sister had gone to bed in the guest room. She sat on the edge of their bathtub and described the smell with as much clinical detachment as she could manage. The words felt like confessions, shameful admissions of a body that had turned against her. David listened without interrupting. His face cycled through confusion, concern, and fear in rapid succession. When she finished, he pulled her into an embrace that lasted several minutes. He promised they would figure this out. He promised they would call Jonathan first thing in the morning. He promised everything would be okay. But even as he spoke the words, Rachel could see the fear in his eyes. He was beginning to understand what she had known for days. Something inside her was dying. The call to Jonathan went exactly as Rachel had expected. David described her symptoms in careful detail, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a husband watching his wife deteriorate. Jonathan listened and asked clarifying questions. He acknowledged that the symptoms were concerning, but emphasized that post-surgical complications could be stubborn. He recommended continuing the antibiotics, adding a topical treatment for the incision site, and giving her body more time to heal. If she was not improving in another week, he said, they should schedule an office visit. Rachel overheard the entire conversation from the bedroom doorway. She watched her husband nod along to Jonathan's explanations, watched him write down the name of a new medication, watched him thank his best friend for the continued support. When the call ended, David turned to her with an expression of cautious optimism. He repeated everything Jonathan had said, as though the words would somehow be more convincing coming from him. 2 days later, Richard arrived unannounced. He had spoken to Rachel the night before, and had not liked what he heard in her voice. He did not call ahead because he knew his daughter would tell him not to worry, not to make the long drive, not to disrupt his life for something that was probably nothing. Richard had never been good at listening to probably nothing. He had spent his career trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming. The moment he walked through Rachel's front door, he understood why. His daughter looked like a ghost of herself. Her skin was sallow, her eyes were sunken. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone experiencing constant pain. Richard pulled David aside that same afternoon. He did not raise his voice or make accusations. He simply stated facts. Rachel was getting worse. The medications were not working. Something was seriously wrong. He wanted her seen by a different doctor at a different hospital, somewhere Jonathan had no connection and no influence. David started to protest, to defend his friend, to explain that Jonathan was one of the best in the field. Richard cut him off with 5 words that silenced every argument. "Your wife is dying, David." The next morning, Rachel found herself in the passenger seat of her father's truck, watching the familiar suburbs of Richmond give way to highways she did not recognize. Richard had arranged an appointment at a hospital 40 miles away, a facility where he knew no one, and no one knew them. He had made the calls the previous night, after everyone else had gone to bed, using the same methodical approach he had applied to every problem in his 63 years of life. Rachel did not argue. She was too tired to argue. She was too tired to do anything except rest her head against the window and watch the world blur past at 70 miles per hour. David had wanted to come, had insisted on coming, but someone needed to stay with the twins, and Rachel's sister had an early flight back to California. So it was just Rachel and her father, the same configuration that had defined so many critical moments in her life since her mother's death. Richard drove in silence for the first 30 minutes. He was not a man who filled empty space with unnecessary words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but soft. "I should have pushed harder," he said. "When you first told me something felt wrong, I should have trusted you. I should have made you switch doctors back then." Rachel reached across the console and placed her hand on his arm. "This is not your fault," she said. "None of this is your fault." The hospital appeared on the horizon around 9:30 in the morning, a sprawling complex of modern buildings that seemed to gleam in the early summer sunlight. Richard parked in the visitor lot and helped Rachel out of the truck, his hand supporting her elbow as they walked slowly toward the entrance. She was weaker than she had been even 2 days ago. The short walk left her winded. The waiting room chairs felt impossibly hard. When a nurse finally called her name, Rachel was not sure she had the strength to stand. The attending physician was a woman named Dr. Eleanor Webb, a 54-year-old obstetrician who had practiced medicine for 23 years. She reviewed Rachel's medical history with quiet attention. She listened to Rachel describe her symptoms without interrupting, and then she ordered a comprehensive abdominal scan, explaining that sometimes the only way to understand what was happening inside was to look. Dr. Webb's examination room was different from Jonathan's office in ways Rachel could not quite articulate. The walls were the same institutional beige. The equipment was equally modern and sterile, but there was a warmth to the space, a sense of unhurried attention that made Rachel feel seen rather than processed. The scan took approximately 45 minutes. Rachel lay on a narrow table while technicians positioned cameras and monitors around her, capturing images of her internal organs from angles she could not imagine. Richard waited in the hallway, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the door through which his daughter had disappeared. The technicians were professional, but unusually quiet. They exchanged glances that Rachel could not interpret. They took far more images than she expected. When they finally helped her sit up, one of them said that Dr. Webb would review the results and speak with her shortly. shortly turned out to be nearly an hour. Rachel sat in an examination room with her father beside her, both of them watching the clock and trying not to imagine the worst. When Dr. Webb finally entered, she was accompanied by two colleagues Rachel had not seen before. The doctor's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes carried something that made Rachel's heart begin to race. Dr. Webb sat down across from Rachel and Richard. She placed a tablet computer on the small table between them, the screen dark for the moment. She began speaking in a measured tone, explaining that the scan had revealed something unexpected. She wanted Rachel to understand that what she was about to see might be disturbing, but that they were going to take immediate action to address it. She wanted Rachel to know that she was in good hands and that they would get through this together. Rachel nodded. She gripped her father's hand with strength she did not know she still possessed. Dr. Webb turned the tablet toward them and activated the screen. The image that appeared was black and gray and white, a cross-section of Rachel's abdomen rendered in the clinical language of medical imaging. And there, unmistakable even to eyes untrained in reading such images, was an object that should not have been there. A metallic shape, 7 inches long, surgical scissors embedded in tissue that had begun to die around them. The room fell silent in the way rooms fall silent when language becomes inadequate. Rachel stared at the image on the screen, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were clearly seeing. The scissors were positioned near her uterus, partially embedded in tissue that the scan showed had become necrotic. The infection her body had been fighting for nearly 5 weeks was not caused by stubborn bacteria or slow healing. It was caused by a foreign object that had been left inside her during surgery. Dr. Webb began explaining what the image meant. She used words like peritonitis and abscess formation and systemic infection. She described how the scissors had perforated Rachel's uterus, creating a wound that had festered and spread. The necrotic tissue surrounding the instrument had been slowly poisoning Rachel's system, releasing toxins that explained the fever, the pain, the smell that had horrified her. She explained that Rachel would need emergency surgery to remove the object and repair the damage. She said, as gently as possible, that the injury to Rachel's uterus was likely permanent. Even with immediate intervention, she would almost certainly never be able to carry another pregnancy. Rachel heard the words as though they were coming from very far away. She thought about Ethan and Emma, barely a month old, waiting at home with a father who did not know what was happening. She thought about the future she had imagined, the larger family she had hoped to build, the siblings she had wanted to give her twins. She thought about Jonathan, about every appointment and every reassurance and every time he had told her to be patient. The images came flooding back now, reframed by this new and terrible knowledge. His comment about her looking the same as in college. His dismissal of her concerns. His insistence that she simply needed more time. Each memory took on a different meaning, a darker significance that made her stomach turn. Richard sat beside her with tears streaming down his face. His hands were shaking. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He wanted to hit something. He wanted to find Jonathan Mercer and make him answer for what he had done. But his daughter needed him here. Needed him to be strong. Needed him to help her survive the next few hours. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. 2 words that carried the weight of everything she was feeling. He knew. Richard's grip on her hand tightened. Dr. Webb leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional concern to something sharper. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "are you suggesting that the surgeon who performed your C-section was aware that instruments had been left inside you?" Rachel looked at the image on the screen, at the scissors that had been destroying her from the inside for 32 days. She thought about every phone call, every dismissive explanation, every time she had trusted him against her own instincts. "Yes," she said. He knew exactly what he did. Dr. Webb moved quickly once Rachel's condition was confirmed. Within 90 minutes, Rachel was prepped for emergency surgery. The procedure would take approximately 4 hours, involving the removal of the scissors, extensive cleaning of the infected tissue, and an assessment of the damage to her reproductive organs. Dr. Webb was honest about the prognosis. The infection had spread significantly. The uterus was severely compromised. There was a strong possibility it would need to be removed entirely. Rachel signed the consent forms with hands that trembled so badly she could barely hold the pen. Richard called David from the hospital corridor, his voice cracking as he delivered news that no husband should ever have to hear. David's response was silence, then a single word repeated over and over. No, 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 no. Richard stayed on the phone with him for 15 minutes, walking him through what was happening, what they had discovered, what was about to take place. By the time he hung up, David was already arranging for a neighbor to watch the twins, so he could drive to the hospital. The surgery began at 2:15 in the afternoon. Rachel was sedated and intubated. Dr. Webb and her team worked methodically, first locating and removing the scissors, then addressing the damage they had caused. The peritonitis had spread throughout Rachel's pelvic cavity. Multiple abscesses had formed and required drainage. The uterus, when they finally assessed it, was beyond saving. Dr. Webb performed a hysterectomy, removing the organ that had carried Ethan and Emma into the world just 5 weeks earlier. David arrived at the hospital around 4 p.m., still wearing the clothes he had thrown on that morning, his face a mask of shock and grief. Richard met him in the waiting area and told him everything. The scissors, the infection, the hysterectomy, the fact that Rachel would survive but would never be able to have more children. David listened without speaking. When Richard finished, David walked to the corner of the waiting room, sat down in a plastic chair, and wept with the kind of helpless anguish that marks the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Rachel emerged from surgery at 6:47 p.m. She was stable but weak, her body exhausted from the trauma it had endured and the aggressive intervention required to save her life. Dr. Webb spoke with David and Richard in the hallway outside recovery, walking them through what she had found and what she had done. She was cautiously optimistic about Rachel's physical recovery. The infection had been addressed. The damaged tissue had been removed. With time and proper care, Rachel would heal. But Dr. Webb had questions of her own. In her 23 years of practice, she had seen retained surgical instruments exactly twice. Both cases had been emergency situations involving multiple traumas and chaotic operating room conditions. Rachel's C-section, by contrast, had been scheduled in advance. It was a controlled environment with a full surgical team. There was no reason for an instrument to have been left behind unless something had gone very wrong. She asked David about the surgery, about the hospital where it had been performed, about the surgeon who had operated. David answered numbly, still processing the reality of what had happened. He told her about Jonathan, about their friendship, about the 20 years of history that had led to this moment. He told her that Jonathan was one of the most respected obstetricians in Virginia. He told her that he had trusted Jonathan with his wife's life because Jonathan was family. Dr. Webb listened carefully. When David finished, she made a decision that would set the next several months in motion. She called the hospital where Rachel's C-section had been performed. She reported the discovery of a retained surgical instrument and requested an immediate review of the case. She documented everything she had found and everything Rachel had told her, and she contacted the Virginia Board of Medicine to file a formal incident report. By the time Rachel woke from anesthesia that evening, with David holding one hand and Richard holding the other, an investigation had already begun. The hospital where Jonathan worked had suspended him pending review. His surgical records were being pulled, his colleagues were being interviewed, and a question that no one wanted to ask was finally being asked. What if this was not an accident? The hospital's internal investigation began within 48 hours of Dr. Webb's report. A team of administrators, legal counsel, and medical directors convened in a conference room to review every document associated with Rachel Mitchell's cesarean section. The stack of paperwork was substantial, encompassing preoperative assessments, surgical checklists, nursing notes, and post-operative summaries. The first irregularity appeared almost immediately. Standard surgical protocol required 2 independent instrument counts, one performed by the circulating nurse and one verified by a second member of the surgical team. In Rachel's case, only one count had been documented. The signature authorizing that count belonged to Jonathan Mercer, the attending physician. He had overridden the standard requirement for secondary verification, a decision that violated hospital policy and circumvented the safety measures designed to prevent exactly this type of catastrophe. The second irregularity was more troubling. The post-operative instrument count showed all 12 surgical tools accounted for. Someone had documented that every item was present and returned to inventory when clearly that was not the case. Either a mistake had been made in the counting process, or someone had falsified the record deliberately. The investigative team pulled Jonathan's surgical history for the past 5 years. They reviewed his complication rates, his patient outcomes, his adherence to protocol. Everything appeared exemplary. His infection rates were below average. His patient satisfaction scores were consistently high. His colleagues described him as meticulous and detail-oriented. There was nothing in his professional history to suggest he was capable of this kind of oversight. But then they discovered the nursing note. Patricia Holloway, the circulating nurse who had been present during Rachel's surgery, had documented a discrepancy in her original count. She had noted that one item appeared to be missing, and that she had raised the concern with Dr. Mercer. His response, according to her notes, was that he had already verified the count, and that she should not hold up the room. Patricia had followed his instructions and completed her paperwork accordingly. The investigators now had a documented moment when the missing scissors could have been identified. They had a documented response from Jonathan dismissing that concern, and they had a falsified final count bearing his signature. The question of whether this was an accident was becoming increasingly difficult to answer in the affirmative. Patricia Holloway was the first member of the surgical team to be formally interviewed. She arrived at the hospital's administrative offices on a Tuesday morning, visibly nervous, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she faced a panel of investigators. She had been a nurse for just over 2 years. She had never been involved in a medical malpractice case. She had never imagined that a routine C-section would result in anything like this. Her account matched the documentation she had provided on the day of surgery. She described performing the post-operative instrument count and discovering the discrepancy. She described approaching Dr. Mercer and expressing her concern. She described his dismissal of her findings and his insistence that she not hold up the room. She described feeling intimidated, uncertain, and ultimately deferential to his authority. The investigators asked why she had not escalated her concerns to another physician or to the nursing supervisor. Patricia's answer was honest and uncomfortable. Dr. Mercer was a senior attending with 15 years of experience, she said. I was a junior nurse who had been on the job for 14 months. He told me the count was correct. I believed him. Sandra Wellington, the veteran surgical nurse who had assisted during the procedure, provided additional testimony that raised new questions. She described Jonathan as professional, but unusually distant during the surgery. She mentioned a moment after the babies had been delivered but before the incision was closed, when Jonathan had paused for an extended period. Nearly 30 seconds, she estimated. He had stood there, staring into Rachel's open abdomen, motionless. When the investigators asked if she had found this behavior unusual, Sandra's response was immediate. Absolutely. I have assisted in over 1,000 surgeries. Surgeons do not stop in the middle of a procedure to stare. They do not freeze up or zone out. Dr. Mercer was always composed, always in control. But in that moment, it was like he was somewhere else entirely. Like he was making a decision about something other than medicine. As the internal investigation progressed, hospital administrators made the decision to involve law enforcement. The circumstances of Rachel's case had moved beyond medical malpractice into territory that suggested potential criminal conduct. A warrant was obtained for Jonathan Mercer's personal electronic devices, including his home computer, his laptop, and his smartphone. The forensic examination of those devices began on July 22, 2019, conducted by a team of investigators with expertise in digital evidence collection. They worked methodically, extracting browsing history, deleted files, and cached data that Jonathan had assumed was gone forever. What they discovered transformed the case from a question of negligence into a question of intent. Jonathan's search history revealed a pattern of queries that stretched back nearly 3 months before Rachel's surgery. In late March, shortly after learning he would be delivering Rachel's twins, he had begun researching complications associated with retained surgical instruments. The searches were specific and detailed, How long before retained surgical objects cause symptoms? Foreign body infection timeline post-surgery. Can scissors be left inside patient without immediate detection? The investigators documented each query, noting the dates and times, building a picture of a man who was studying the consequences of an action he had not yet taken. In April, his searches shifted to legal territory. He researched the difference between medical malpractice and criminal liability. He read case studies of physicians who had been prosecuted for surgical errors versus those who faced only civil penalties. He examined the evidentiary standards required to prove intentional harm versus negligence. One search, conducted just 2 weeks before Rachel's surgery, asked a question that made the lead investigator pause. Can intent be proven without confession medical malpractice? The investigators documented over 40 individual searches related to retained surgical instruments, infection timelines, and criminal prosecution of medical professionals. The searches were conducted over a period of 8 weeks, with the frequency increasing as Rachel's due date approached. The final search, conducted the night before her surgery, was chillingly simple. Complications: retained scissors, cesarean. When the lead investigator presented these findings to the district attorney's office, the response was immediate. This was not the research pattern of a physician concerned about potential complications. This was not the due diligence of a careful surgeon preparing for a difficult case. This was preparation. This was planning. This was a man who wanted to understand the consequences of his actions before he took them. The warrant for Jonathan Mercer's arrest was drafted that same afternoon. The most damaging evidence came not from Jonathan's search history, but from his personal communications. Investigators recovered text messages and email exchanges that revealed a pattern of obsession dating back years, long before Rachel's pregnancy, long before the surgery that destroyed her ability to have more children. Jonathan had maintained sporadic contact with a former college roommate named Derek Simmons, someone who had known about his feelings for Rachel during their university years. The messages between them spanned more than a decade, and they painted a portrait of a man who had never moved beyond a rejection that happened when he was 20 years old. In 2015, 3 years after David and Rachel's wedding, Jonathan had written to Derek about seeing the couple at a mutual friend's gathering. "Watched them all night," the message read. She looked happy, she looked beautiful, and she was looking at him. It never gets easier. In 2018, after learning that Rachel and David were trying to have children, Jonathan's tone shifted. "David gets everything," he wrote. "The girl, the career, now a family. What do I get? What have I ever gotten?" The most incriminating message was sent just 3 months before Rachel's surgery. Jonathan had written to Derek about the pregnancy, about being asked to serve as Rachel's physician. "He is bringing her to me," the message read. "After everything, he is putting her in my hands. Life has a strange sense of humor." Derek's response asked what Jonathan planned to do. Jonathan's reply was brief but haunting. "She made her choice 15 years ago. Choices have consequences." And now, finally, the scales are about to tip. The prosecutors now had evidence of motive. They had evidence of planning. They had evidence of a man who had spent 15 years nursing a wound and had finally found an opportunity to make someone else bleed. On August 3, 2019, at approximately 7:30 in the morning, Jonathan Mercer was arrested at his home in a quiet suburb of Richmond. He was preparing for work when the doorbell rang. He opened it to find 4 police officers and 2 detectives standing on his front porch, a warrant for his arrest in hand. The charges were severe: aggravated assault with intent to cause bodily harm, medical malpractice resulting in permanent injury, reckless endangerment. The combined potential sentences, if he were convicted on all counts, exceeded 25 years in prison. Jonathan did not resist. He did not argue or protest his innocence. He simply asked if he could change out of his bathrobe before being taken into custody. The officers allowed him to put on clothes under their supervision. He was then handcuffed, led to a waiting police vehicle, and transported to the county jail for processing. The arrest made local news within hours. A respected physician, a trusted member of the medical community, led away in handcuffs on charges that seemed almost unbelievable. His colleagues expressed shock and disbelief. His patients, dozens of whom had trusted him with the most intimate moments of their lives, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the accusations being made against him. David Mitchell learned of the arrest from a news alert on his phone. He was sitting in the hospital room where Rachel was recovering, holding her hand while she slept, when the notification appeared. He stared at the screen for a long time, reading the same 3 sentences over and over. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, where visitors came and went, unaware that a man's entire world had just finished collapsing. That evening, when Rachel woke, David told her about the arrest. She listened without speaking, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. When he finished, she asked a single question. "Did they find the messages?" David nodded. "Then maybe now people will believe me," she said. "Maybe now they will understand what he really is." The trial of Jonathan Mercer began on January 14, 2020, in a courtroom that had seen its share of sensational cases, but nothing quite like this. The gallery was packed with reporters, medical professionals, and ordinary citizens drawn by a story that seemed ripped from the pages of a thriller. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Michelle Foster, had spent months building a case that hinged on a single argument. This was not an accident. This was not negligence. This was a deliberate act of revenge carried out by a man who had spent 15 years waiting for the opportunity. The opening statement lasted nearly 2 hours. Foster walked the jury through every piece of evidence they would see over the coming weeks. She described Jonathan's obsession with Rachel, documented through years of messages and journal entries. She outlined his search history, the dozens of queries about retained surgical instruments and their consequences. She explained how he had overridden safety protocols, dismissed a nurse's concerns, and falsified medical records to cover his actions. She described the damage done to Rachel's body, the emergency surgery, the hysterectomy, the permanent loss of her ability to bear children. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator named Walter Pemberton, offered a very different narrative. His client was a dedicated physician who had made a terrible mistake under pressure. The search history proved only that Jonathan was a conscientious doctor, researching potential complications. The messages showed heartache, not criminal intent. The surgery was complicated. Accidents happen. To suggest that a man would deliberately mutilate a patient because of an unrequited college crush was not just absurd, it was an insult to the medical profession. The jury listened to both sides with careful attention. 12 ordinary citizens who would ultimately decide whether Jonathan Mercer was a monster in a white coat or a scapegoat being sacrificed on the altar of tragedy. The truth, they would discover, was more complicated than either story suggested. Rachel Mitchell testified on the 4th day of the trial. She entered the courtroom on David's arm, moving slowly but steadily toward the witness stand. She had lost weight since the surgery. Her face was thinner, but her eyes were clear and determined, the eyes of a woman who had decided that her pain would not be wasted. The prosecution's questions walked her through the entire relationship, from the first moment she met Jonathan in college to the morning of her surgery. She described the awkward introduction in the dining hall, his comment during her first prenatal appointment, the persistent unease she had felt throughout her pregnancy. She described the symptoms that followed the C-section, the dismissive phone calls with Jonathan, the 5 weeks of deterioration before her father finally intervened. When the prosecutor asked about her current condition, Rachel's voice remained steady. "I cannot have more children," she said. "The twins I have are the only children I will ever have. Jonathan took that from me. He did not take it by accident. He took it because I did not choose him 20 years ago." The cross-examination was aggressive. Pemberton questioned Rachel's interpretation of events, suggesting that her discomfort around Jonathan was nothing more than social awkwardness blown out of proportion. He pointed out that she had never actually asked to change doctors, had never formally complained about his behavior. Rachel's response was measured but powerful. "I trusted my husband's judgment. I trusted their friendship. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought my instincts were wrong. I will spend the rest of my life wishing I had listened to them." When the defense attorney suggested that the scissors being left inside her was simply a tragic accident, Rachel leaned forward slightly. "He researched how long it would take for me to get sick," she said. He researched what would happen to my body. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left those scissors inside me. Accidents do not plan themselves. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard testimony from 16 witnesses, including surgeons, nurses, forensic analysts, and psychological experts. They reviewed hundreds of pages of documents. They examined the search history, the messages, the falsified medical records. They listened to Jonathan Mercer himself, who took the stand in his own defense and maintained, through hours of questioning, that he had made an honest mistake. Closing arguments were delivered on February 6, 2020. The prosecution summarized the evidence with precision, emphasizing the pattern of obsession, the deliberate planning, the callous dismissal of concerns that could have saved Rachel from 5 weeks of suffering. The defense appealed to doubt, arguing that the case was built on circumstantial evidence and psychological speculation. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days of discussions and debates, of reviewing evidence and revisiting testimony, of 12 people trying to reach a unanimous conclusion about what had happened in that operating room. On February 11th, at 3:47 in the afternoon, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a solemn expression, stood and delivered the verdict. On the charge of aggravated assault with intent to cause bodily harm, guilty. On the charge of medical malpractice resulting in permanent injury, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. Jonathan Mercer showed no visible reaction. His face remained the same impassive mask he had worn throughout the trial. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. The gallery erupted in whispers and gasps and the sound of reporters rushing for the exits to file their stories. Rachel sat in the front row of the gallery, her husband on one side and her father on the other. When the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, she did not cry. She did not celebrate. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, releasing something she had been holding for longer than she could remember. Jonathan Mercer was sentenced on March 15, 2020. The judge, a veteran of the bench who had seen countless criminals stand before her, delivered remarks that would be quoted in legal textbooks for years to come. She described Jonathan as a man who had weaponized his profession, who had used his position of trust to inflict harm on a vulnerable patient. She noted the premeditation evident in his research, the cruelty evident in his dismissal of Rachel's suffering, the arrogance evident in his belief that he would never be caught. She sentenced him to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. His medical license was revoked permanently. Rachel watched the sentencing from the same seat she had occupied throughout the trial. She did not speak publicly afterward. She did not grant interviews or issue statements. She simply walked out of the courthouse with David and her father, climbed into a waiting car, and drove away from the building where her pain had finally been acknowledged. In the months that followed, Rachel focused on recovery. She attended physical therapy to address the lingering effects of her surgery. She worked with a counselor to process the trauma she had experienced. She spent hours with Ethan and Emma, memorizing their faces, recording their milestones, building a relationship with the children who would be her only children. In an interview conducted 1 year after the trial, Rachel reflected on what Jonathan had taken from her. "I have 2 beautiful children," she said. "I am grateful for them every single day. But I also mourn the children I will never have. The family I imagined will never exist. Jonathan did not just leave scissors inside me. He stole a future I will never get back." She paused before continuing. "But he did not take everything. He did not take my marriage. He did not take my father. He did not take Ethan and Emma. He thought he was settling a score, punishing me for a choice I made when I was 20 years old. But all he did was destroy himself." Rachel Donovan Mitchell survived. She rebuilt her life around the family she had left. She learned to live with absence and to find gratitude in presence. And Jonathan Mercer? He sits in a prison cell, surrounded by concrete walls and iron bars, with nothing but time to consider what his obsession cost him and what it could never give him back. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more documentaries like this one. Your support means everything to us.